Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark McNacken, and my co-host Rob Brandt and I are joined today by Kluane Adamek, Chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council to Canada's Major Projects Office, the 11-member national body Prime Minister Mark Carney appointed to guide how major resource and infrastructure projects move through the federal system. Since Carney launched the office in August 2025, it has referred 15 nation-building projects worth more than 125 billion Canadian dollars. Kluane served as Assembly of First Nations Yukon Regional Chief from 2018 to 2025, leading their national files on climate, environment, and water before stepping into this new advisory role. In the first of two conversations, she sets out why a nation's answer of yes, but not right now, is a planning signal rather than a rejection. Why relationship and shared information do more than speed to shorten a project's path to certainty, and where her council's advice actually carries weight. Kluane Adamek, welcome to Drumbeats. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm really happy to be here.
Hey, Kluane. Great to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Well, it's a great honor to have you here. And as you know, we have listeners from around the world, primarily from the UK over here and from the continent. Can you just describe, first of all, where you are, and also then about yourself and a little bit about your experience growing up and where you've landed today, because you're in some very important roles.
Yeah, thank you so much, and really looking forward to having a conversation. My name is Kluane Adamek. My Tlingit name is Age, and I am from Kluane First Nation, which is in the southwest Yukon. All very Googleable, but there is a lot of really neat research actually that takes place in my territory. Of course, this is a photo of Kluane Lake, a very special place, of course, to our people, but also to me as well. I have on my father's side Tlingit and Southern Shoshone ancestry, and on my mom a mix of settler Canadians, so actually Scottish and Irish and German. So a really interesting blend, I would say, in terms of all the different histories and the lineages that I come from. I have a 3-year-old daughter named Tayana Copperjane. And what's special about Tayana is I knew I always wanted to be a mom, and I was in an elected position as the regional chief at the time, and sort of, the reality for women, of course, is there is a set period of time that you have. And so I had my daughter at 37. And it was at that point after I had her where I had this moment of, how am I best contributing? Most importantly, how am I best contributing to her and supporting her in her world? And also able to continue to contribute to community and the region and First Nations broadly. And so at that point, my partner and I made the decision that would be my last term. So I served for nearly 8 years as the regional chief, and have since stepped into some spaces that I was in, I would say, more engaged in earlier in my career. So I was on our board for our economic development corporation, and I did an MBA at SFU. And so at the end of my term, I was appointed by Prime Minister Carney to the Indigenous Advisory Council, to the Major Projects Office. And so that's been where a lot of my contributions have been leaning towards. And this conversation around, building strong, building better, and the work that I contributed to as regional chief was to lead the environment and water stewardship files. And so I've always felt there's always been this sort of, in my view, this perhaps rhetoric around the environment or major projects, the environment or let's drive the economy. And I don't see it that way. I never really have. And I feel like for a lot of Indigenous peoples, we there's a lot of challenge when we're not balancing the environment and driving the economy through major projects or infrastructure development. But when things are in balance, it can work really well. And so that has been in the last year or so, the space that I've welcomed in my world, and really happy to join the Indigenous Advisory Council. There's 11 of us. I'm currently serving as the chair, and my co-chair, Vanessa Doig, who's Inuk. And so it's just a depth and breadth and wealth of knowledge on the council. And so I've been really enjoying that.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your background for us. And I think we've had this discussed with a number of guests. And we talked earlier, Southern Canadians versus Canadians from further north, which is so important to Canada these days. And there's an announcement that's just come out today in the news that I'm sure you've had some visibility of, in terms of Canada has chosen to partner with the German manufacturer of submarines, which is the first significant investment in defense Canada has made, and it's strategic because many people forget we're a three-ocean country.
Yeah, good point.
The Arctic has been forgotten for a long time. And historically, though, the Yukon has played an absolutely critical role in the defense of Canada, going back to World War II, or going back to prior to that with the acquisition by the Americans of the Russian territory on North America at the time. So Yukon has always been kind of an anchor for the country. And we now have this moment forward where defense is coming back to be an important part, but circle back to what you were talking about when it all comes together. And I think this is the real exceptional opportunity Canada has, because Canada's reinventing itself as a country. As you know, under Prime Minister Carney and what's happened south of the border, we've had to reinvent our outlook for the future because it's changed dramatically. And fortunately, at this point in time, the Indigenous people have a voice. Indigenous people are in leadership positions across the country. There's some strong organizations, Desneti, for example, out of Saskatchewan, who are participating in these major decisions. So it's really an inflection point. And as you talked about just on your own individual journey, it was how could you best contribute? And here you are now chair of the Indigenous Advisory Council for the Major Project Coalition. So first of all, congratulations on all that you've achieved so far. And you have a leadership role that affects all Canadians. So really interesting story. So thank you for being with us on the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm like, let's jump in. Let's go there.
Yes. Okay. Well, we got to come back to your TED Women 2020 talk on Yukon Matriarchs. And I understand it's been watched by over 1.4 million times, which is a lot of people watching. And, that must have been quite a platform and recognition for women across Canada and for Indigenous women in particular.
I think that's where a lot of, when I recall when I was first elected and sort of showing up in spaces and feeling that discord, perhaps, in just generally, not just how I was perhaps treated, but other women who are in the space. And it is a very different worldview when you're coming from a space where women have always been included in decision making, have been advising the decision makers or directing the decision makers. Is very different than when you're coming from a more Western colonial worldview, where has been largely centered around men and sort of patriarchal roles of significance. And so that's where in the Yukon, we have a clan system, an animal clan system. And so you are born into your clan through your mother. And for myself, having a non-Indigenous mother, I was adopted, which is an incredibly important, a significant moment in one's life where the clan includes you. And so that sense of identity and connection and responsibility is one that you don't carry lightly. And that is where, when showing up in other spaces, and particularly, political spaces, but now that I'm in more sort of industry, a lot of conversations with industry partners, a lot of conversations with rights holders, there is a bit of a rub. And so that TED Talk was really to help people understand that, first of all, leadership is a responsibility, not a status. And that when it comes to matriarchy, this is a term you're seeing a lot of young Indigenous people starting to talk about. The matriarchy is back. There's a matriarchy movement. But it really is about holding up the space for women to not only be included, but to be the decision makers. And women in so many Yukon First Nations communities and communities across the country have always been in those positions. It's sort of now we're re-acknowledging that is the case, and that needs to be so. And so that was really what the TED Talk was about. And I hope people took something away from that. I hope they listen to the story I shared about resilience and continuity. And that is something that I often go back to in moments where I feel ungrounded or need to remind myself why I'm doing what I'm doing. So that is perhaps we could probably talk a whole podcast episode on it. But for Cole's Notes version, that was a really special moment.
Wow. And I think one of the things in terms of the leadership that you're providing at the moment, you have this ongoing commitment to learning and development, which is always a sign of a great leader. You've completed your MBA, executive MBA in Indigenous Business Leadership at Simon Fraser's Beatty School in BC. You're completing the Institute of Corporate Directors designation, or just completed?
Yeah.
Another one under your belt. Wow. And look at the positions you're holding. So what drew you to formalize that education experience, given all the learnings you had? You had the on-the-job experience. You were providing those leadership roles. What added value do you think that brings to you and that other people should be considering?
When I think about particularly the listeners that you have across the pond, so to speak, but here in Canada and beyond, growing up on both sides of my family, education was always sort of a non-negotiable. It didn't matter what it was that you decided to pursue, but that there was an expectation that you would further your education. And, my grandmother, residential school survivor at a certain period of time, illegal for her to go to university. My aunts and uncles, one of my aunts went later in life, but I was definitely one of the first in my family to pursue and to complete my undergraduate degree. And my mom, neither of my grandparents went to university. My grandfather immigrated from Germany after the Second World War and had a grade 8 education and was able to sort of really navigate. He worked for the governor of the Bank of Canada. That's like a whole other story. But like this whole space around education and a responsibility to learn and to grow was always there for me. And so kind of in my own life, it's sort of been every 10 years. Every 10 years, I've told myself I'm going to do something. I'm going to go back. I'm going to either relearn or learn new. And so the undergrad, the MBA, and the ICD, and what I've put on a bit of a back burner, which I haven't shared widely, but we'll share here, is I was accepted into a PhD program for this year, and then sort of said those moments where there can be so many opportunities, right, in one's lifetime, but it's always about timing, right? And so how do you make sure that the contributions and where you use your time is going to best suit your priorities? And of course, having a little girl, that's my first. My second is, of course, contributing to my region. And then third, how do I bring that experience to support rights holders across the country and beyond. So I'll come back to the PhD at some point. Yukon's also starting a law school, which has kind of piqued my interest a bit. I was going to go and then didn't at another point in my life. So it really is about, education, prosperity, and responsibility, in my view, are all pieces that go hand in hand. And because for both of my grandparents, they never had the opportunity. My mom, the first in my family, as a single parent to go to university, and able to be resourced, it's kind of like, why not? Like, this is an opportunity for not only for me, but for other people in my community or my daughter to see their parents continuing to pursue education.
Yes. And I think one of the interesting things, thank you for sharing that. And I thought you were going to say in the PhD program you were working on the weekends. I thought, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Super
Take a pause.
Okay.
Take a pause.
But I think one of the things this demonstrates for those who haven't been investing in Canada recently or now re-looking at it is the Indigenous people are seizing the opportunities in front of that were denied for so long. And it's, as the country is reinventing itself, the Indigenous people, as we've just talked about, have reclaimed and are reclaiming their rightful place in the leadership and the development of the country. It's kind of the attitude you bring, because we've come across, if you're choosing a partner today in Canada, forget about the rights holders issue that you have to deal with rights holders. Some of the partners you want to choose to work with are Indigenous-led or Indigenous companies, because they are hungry and out fighting because they've been so long oppressed and held back. Now that this moment has come, we see that coming through in terms of the competitive spirit. If we talk about the animal spirits coming back, the clan system, you also see those animal spirits that we like to talk about in the UK reinvigorating the Canadian economy, because you're shaking it up because you have a long-term view, the Indigenous people, that they bring to projects. It's not, how do we buy something and flip it? It's, we're going to live with this. So how do we do it in the right way so it's sustainable, plus provide those long-term returns for our community and for the country? So maybe we just pivot from there and talk a little bit. September 25, you were appointed by Prime Minister Carney to the new Indigenous Advisory Council for the Major Projects Office. And for listeners who have not been following closely, can you talk a little bit about what the council is and what the MPO is, what exactly you're being asked to do? Because on the other hand, there's 600 plus chiefs around the country who all have their perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is it was definitely a surprise to myself, and didn't know who else would be on the council when this sort of all happened. I also was still in my elected office, and so had to qualify. Is this a me thing as Kluane, or is this you're interested in sort of the role thing? And so once all those pieces came to light and were solidified, and after speaking to some leaders in my region, I decided that it was a really important place to step into, to contribute to. It was new, but that there's so much around, improving not only the relationship and the process, policy, legislation, but ultimately the livelihood of First Nations people, and knowing that there would be a space to ensure that Northern considerations would be at the table. I come from a modern treaty nation, and so that those perspectives could be shared. And of course, the invaluable experience serving as regional chief and working with First Nations right across the country in various files. So I said yes, and the role really, as the IAC, I mean, it's pretty clear. We are advisory. So I know that some of the assumptions out there are that, we get this stack of 200 projects and we decide. That is not what we do. It's more once projects have been referred. And so there's a different process right under the Act, which I also would love to see more people get far more briefed up on. There's the deferred and designated. And so we really get brought in once the federal government has sort of worked through all the processes. We have provided advice in the past on what you really need to think about when it comes to rights holders being either a proponent, being a partner, having some type of equity in the project, or being a support. What are the things you need to think about before you say yes? So we've provided some of that advice. And of course, when some nations have said no and some nations have said yes, how do you navigate that? So that's some of the advice that we've provided. But we really, our role really sort of gets triggered after a project is referred or designated. And then we can jump in and provide advice to the MPO. Some examples were that recent legislation. There was an engagement period that was like a month long. And so, of course, the IAC was like, hey, that's not going to work. You should really think about extending it. There were calls for extending it by rights holders, by leaders, and so it happened. So there's, a number of different key players and influencers that, of course, are have the ear of government, and so the IAC really, providing that advice and insight to the Major Projects Office, and being able to, help government with how they create relationship. Like relationships in this day and age create certainty, and better relationships lead to better decisions. And so how do we help those who are in the place of making those relationships do so in a better way, in a more thoughtful way, and a rights-based way?
Yes. Well, thank you for that.
Kluane, one of the things we hear from especially foreign investors is, have things really changed in Canada? And the Major Projects Office was a new initiative. The Indigenous Advisory Council is new. How would you answer that question? It's now been almost a year working with Major Projects Office on the council. That's one of the new initiatives, but have things really changed?
So first of all, I think there's a couple of different pieces. One, how have things changed with government, right? The second thing I think about is where is sort of the relationship? And in each nation, it could be very different with the federal government than others. But then there's this sort of broadly, where are Indigenous peoples at with this government? And then for investors, where have we seen, to your point, big shifts? The first thing I'll say, and I've shared this story in a couple of recent opportunities, this federal government is going very quickly. The Prime Minister has said he will do that, and that is what he's doing. The one thing that I'm reminded of, and a leader said this to me pretty early in my career serving as regional chief, and I was sort of trying to do all the things, and for myself, it was, I was younger, and I felt I needed to sort of show, yes, I said I was going to do these things, and so I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do them all right now. And this leader sort of said to me, Kluane, when you're walking in the bush and you turn around and your people aren't there behind you, then you've gone too far. And I sort of realized, okay, you can still move forward in the bush with your people, but sometimes you're going really fast. And so that has been, I would say, the story that I continue to share when I can, that there's a lot happening. And I'm very mindful of the reality of so many of our communities where people are dealing with, access to clean drinking water, mold in schools and homes. Now we're dealing with, flooding and wildfire. Like up in Northwest Territories, again, a community has just been evacuated, and they're likely going to see significant damage. So then, industry or partners or governments like, hey, we want to do this engagement on this legislation or this process, and really need you to participate in 30 days. And it's, people can't catch a breath. So that has been, I think, and I hope that message is reigning pretty clear to those in spaces of decision-making authority, that it's also about meeting people where they're at. And I know that can be an uncomfortable conversation sometimes with industry, who's very concerned about, project timelines, certainty, bottom line, et cetera. Some of the best examples of projects that have been that have moved forward have been about meeting people where they're at. And it's a super simple concept, not just working with Indigenous peoples, but sometimes it's yes later. Sometimes it's yes, but not right now. We need more time. Sometimes it's we're thinking about yes, but we're not ready to make a decision and our people need to get more information. So it's sort of those are the examples that I think are really important for industry to better understand, because things are moving. Some nations are ready to go. Other nations need more time. And so the specific project that someone might be interested in might not work right now, but maybe in 5 years, there's much more of an aptitude, and the nation has sort of been able to build capacity to even get people comfortable to make the decision. So those are some of I think with industry, I always like to sort of break it down in that way because there is a lot of pressure on rights holders and there's so many different facets of the responsibilities they carry. And so it's like just taking a pause and understanding where the community is at. It's not always no, but it's not always yeah, we're in right now.
Yeah, that's an important reminder. This podcast focuses on economic development issues, but of course there's social issues as well. And many times, especially when you're dealing with band councils or Indigenous councils, they're wearing multiple hats, and there's only so much capacity to deal with. But what does seem different is there's more meaningful engagement now, and meaningful participation is on offer. And these projects are, generational. And when we talk about 7 generations, there needs to be a little bit of patience at the outset to do things properly and at the right pace, as you say.
I mean, I think that's one of the most important things perhaps for industry to maybe lean in on a bit more is that it's not just about faster projects, it's about better projects, right? Like we can't do what we've been doing as a country where, to your point, like Indigenous peoples weren't engaged. We ended up dealing with, how many, dozens of court cases that sort of reaffirm that there is a process. There are, inherent rights. There's constitutionally protected rights. There's treaty rights. Like there's a whole basket of rights that need to be not just considered, but that need to be at the center when we're talking about these projects. So the fastest path to certainty is about building relationship and building trust. And making sure everyone's working with the same information. I find that's also like one of the hugest gaps when we're talking about projects is not everyone's working with the same information. Perhaps the Dev Corp to Chief and Council to some of the other limited partnerships that exist have all this information, and then they bring it to the people, and the people might have just received this information. Like there's been some awesome examples, like up in the Tahltan Nation, is it Red Creek or Red Chris Mine? The number of engagements, that they had was astounding in my view. But then I had to think about it. I'm like, is it astounding, or should that just be the bottom line? Where like they're making sure that everybody has the opportunity, both place and space, whether it's Yukon or BC, in all of their communities. And I thought that was really that should, in my view, be the sort of the bottom line, to make sure that everybody is working with the same information, so that people can feel good about the decision or the direction that they're either supporting or that they might not be supporting.
I think that's very insightful about what is happening on the ground. And as you said, how is that knowledge dispersed and how do you get everyone up to speed? Kluane, thanks for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into Drumbeats, where we bring you the capital markets intelligence that matters for Indigenous investment in Canada. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.